Starless Towers. When Hagen Kalman had received a letter from Elias Ward 6 weeks earlier, he had rushed into action. The journey back from Canada had seemed arduous. Every moment on the train, the boat, and, finally, the carriage, had seemed insufferable. Their friendship had demanded his urgency. The rambling gibberish of the letter had elicited his fear. It felt as though something had cracked the man's sanity like an egg. The winding path along the dirt road towards Starless Towers was uneven and seemingly endless. Whilst Hagen could see the faint silhouette in the distance, it held itself just as far away, no matter how long he travelled. He clutched his Gladstone and his duffel bag with increasing anxiety. The shroud of night was descending upon the Yorkshire moors, and he had all the intention of being indoors before that happened. "How much farther?" Hagen called out to the driver over the increasing roar of the wind. The man, sat sullenly on his box, was not the most jovial sort. Without turning, he barked in a thick Yorkshire accent that it was 20 to 30 minutes away. His focus then returned to the horses, who dutifully did as instructed. Hagen felt like he was leaving civilization behind, the scant lights of the nearest village completely abandoned, just a sickly twilight to envelop them. His breath swirled in the cold air. He needed to know what on earth was going on. When the full details of Starless hove into view, its thick walls, the wrought iron gates, the lush vegetation and the fortified manor, some of Hagen's anxiety abated. The driver abruptly stopped the carriage and insisted he depart. The horses suddenly showed signs of a nervousness that was affecting even the sullen man. Hagen gathered his things, paid the man, and began to walk up the path. The surrounding trees swayed in the wind as the carriage rapidly turned about and raced away into the night. A light tremor quivered through his stomach, and he swore the icon around his neck had begun to vibrate. Then quiet. The wind dropped down and there was silence. The last of the light was failing. He needed to get moving. The gates, with their design of an eclipse and a half-star, were ajar. The fact added to Hagen's disquiet as he slipped through the gap and made his way towards the entrance. Beyond the walls, the grounds looked tired. The once pristine gardens were becoming overgrown. Trees were being choked by vines. Chaos had completely overtaken them. It had been 5 years since he had last been there. How could things have become so bad? Had Elias and his family run out of money? Had they fired the staff? What was going on here? He also noticed the lack of barking as he grew nearer. It did not bode well for Clarence, an excitable and decidedly playful Rottweiler, who had never been able to contain his enthusiasm upon the approach of any person. It made his heart feel heavier than he expected. The cobbled pathway was an effort to walk across, loose stones and weeds marring the way. As he closed on the entrance, he thought he saw faint lights hiding behind the curtains. Little specks of luminescence trying so hard to escape into the outside world. The silence around him continued, and gnawed hungrily at his calm. It felt wrong. With great insistence and energy, Hagen slammed the knocker at the entrance with all his might. It shook the solid oak and sent echoes throughout the house. He wanted it to be loud, to chase away the little thoughts at his shoulders, to have the darkness turn and run. Waiting as patiently as he could, he stood there, cold beginning to seep into his bones. After a minute or two he heard movement, the sound of bolts retracting, and whispered voices that wanted to be a shout. Then the creaking and moaning as the immense oak door swung backwards. The faces that met him were creased, well used, furrowed in concern. At the fore, Tom Nye, the butler, and Etta Jackson, the cook. Hagen knew them instantly. Their faces were familiar, even if the grey pallor was not. After a few seconds of delving into their own memories, the pair relaxed, not solely in pleasure, but in sheer relief. Something was very, very wrong here.
"My goodness, it really is good to see you, Mr. Kalman. It's been far too long since you last visited, far too long,"
Nye exclaimed. Etta nodded in emphatic agreement.
"It really is good to see you, sir."
"Thank you, both of you. It's good to see you too. I hope you're well." There was no answer apart from a clearing of the throat. "Well, I do not wish to seem rude, but I've come a long way to see Elias, and I rather thought it best that I address him immediately." The nervousness returned, and Nye and Etta stared at each other.
"Oh, well, you see, the master, he's..."
Etta said before Nye interjected.
"He has retired for the evening, sir."
Hagen reached into his waistcoat and checked his pocket watch. It was barely 10 minutes past 7. Already?
Yes, sir. The master is not quite feeling himself recently. He's been having many early nights.
No, I did not sound entirely convincing. Is this why he asked for me so urgently? Is he unwell? There was a silence that stretched out. Edda decided to break it.
I think you'd best speak to the master come the morning.
Hagen was about to press for more information, but he could see it in their eyes. They didn't want this conversation, and they would not accept its continuance.
If you follow me, sir, I have one of the guest rooms prepared for you.
Where were the other staff? Where were the maids? Where were the groundskeepers? What was going on? Starless Towers looked tired on the inside, almost as much as it did on the outside. A dusty dampness was thickening the air, and every part of the building seemed to creak. As the wind outside found its voice again, the roof rattled and groaned. The walls seemed to chatter in protest, and the entirety of it felt decidedly unsafe. The guest room was like ice. Even after Nye lit the hearth, it still froze Hagen to the core. His teeth chattered lightly as an array of blankets and throws were all produced for his convenience and comfort. He would lay many above his body, and undoubtedly still freeze. Nye made apologies for the state of the room. There was genuine shame in his voice, and the tremble of upset. He lit 2 more candles and looked mournfully at Hagen.
I shall see you in the morning, sir.
Left in the once opulent room, Hagen's first priority was to open his Gladstone. Inside, 2 pistols, 6 boxes of ammunition, 4 books, which the church would gleefully burn, and his notebook, wrapped in paper and string. He didn't change for bed. He loaded a pistol and tucked it into his waistband. Then he unwrapped his notebook. Inside, a handful of photographs. Jo, whom he had left back in Canada, insisting she not follow him, a picture of his old home back in Liverpool, and, finally, a picture of himself and the men he had served with. From the 12 in the picture, only he, Elias, and Private Brooks were now alive. The scars on his back itched as he looked at the picture. Memories poked at him.
Shut up,
he muttered beneath his breath, but he knew that they wouldn't. They never did. Eventually, he blew out the candles and folded himself into the blankets. Sitting in the dark, he waited for sleep. It would come eventually, and, he hoped, it would come alone. The noise was deafening. How any of them were expected to hear each other was beyond him. Mud below sucked at their boots, damp seeping into their skin. Men screamed and shouted, mixtures of orders, reprimands, begs of mercy, and pleas for help. The German guns strafed back and forth. It was an orgy of utterly pointless death. Lives thrown away in sheer futility at this madness. This sheer fucking madness. Hagen felt like his ears were going to burst. He tried to focus, but nothing was making sense. The gunfire, the explosions, the screaming. God, stop the screaming. Who was screaming? Just stop, damn you. Nothing felt real. He was swimming inside his head whilst this nightmare played out. He'd volunteered for this. He'd volunteered. What in Christ's name had he done? Roberts rolled back into the trench. Most of his right leg was missing, ripped to shreds by machine gun fire. There were just bits of flesh and bone hanging loosely. Blood poured everywhere. He screamed. He screamed like nothing Hagen had ever heard before. He screamed to Elias for the medic. Elias couldn't hear. Frantically pointing at Roberts and shouting at the top of his lungs, Elias cast his sight down to the injured soldier. His stomach rolled. The colour dropped from his face. Blood and cordite filled the air. Panic was encasing them, squeezing tighter. Elias regained his composure and ran to fetch help. Hagen knelt down beside Roberts. The boy was trying to make a request, or, perhaps, a deathbed confession. He could not hear a single word. Then, the midday sun was swallowed whole. Black, swollen clouds collected above, pressing down hard upon them all. Then a rampant mist began to roll across the fields. Sheer terror filled every soldier. My God, was it mustard gas? Frantically, men clambered to fetch their gas masks so they might be protected. But Hagen, he stayed still, knowing that it was not the dreaded German weapon. He felt the icon about his neck begin to hum. Its warmth spread across his flesh. It began to sear. The ground began gurgling, the sounds of drowning in the thick mud. Hagen held Robert's hand tightly. He was going into shock.
Where is that damn medic?
He bawled. But nobody could hear him. He couldn't see Elias. He couldn't see Brooks. Christ, he wouldn't be seeing much of anyone soon. The mist kept creeping further and further inwards. The German guns fell silent. The English guns fell silent. Everything stopped apart from the moans and cries of pain and bitter agony. The moment felt pregnant with something. The icon gave out a high-pitched ringing. Only Hagen could hear it, but he knew it was an ill omen. He looked into Robert's eyes. The light was fading. That spark of what made him alive was slipping away. The earth beneath began to belch. Soil and filth began to shake and split and turn. Out from the darkness, something was coming. Robert's hand went slack and slipped from Hagen's grasp. Hagen picked up the trench gun by his side and began to feed in shells. He screamed out, "Elias, get the fuck over here!" In a moment, he saw his friend come into view, the medic beside him. "Shit," Elias muttered from behind his mask. The word echoed eerily. One word was all he had energy for. "Elias, get your gun ready!" Hagen barked. "But what about the It isn't mustard gas. Grab your fucking gun and get over here." The first hands began to push through the ground, with their pallid skin and razor claws, their maws lined with blades set to strip skin from bone. Their eyes were black and dead, their snouts filled with the intoxicating scent of blood. Bemusement and then sheer terror swept across both camps. Under the black and red sky, the massacre began. Agents of a sleeping god here to feast on this banquet of death, to feed their ruler and wake him from his slumber. Hagen broke into the world of the waking, the rumbling of the ground giving way to screams, the rattling of chandeliers, the foundations of the building shaking in protest. Coal dislodged in the fireplace. The filth of the trenches still tried to submerge part of his reeling mind. Dreams and reality collided, and the air seemed so thin. The icon felt warm against his chest. It whispered at the back of his thoughts, desperately warning him of the peril. Fumbling out of bed, he lit a pair of candles and placed his duffel bag onto the bed. Inside, he removed the small lantern and lit it, then clasped the trench gun firmly between his fingers and slung it over his shoulder, the tired leather strap at home there. The noises were getting louder. Animated voices were raised in sheer panic. Throwing the door open, Hagen went straight to the reception where Edda and Nye were arguing. Upon seeing him, the pair rushed over, tears already streaming down Edda's face.
"Please, sir, please, go back to bed. Go back and—"
"Quiet!" Edda shouted.
"Enough of this, Tom. Damn what he said. Damn him, and damn staying here."
Edda began to cry. Nye turned to her for a moment and then shook his head.
"I just didn't know what I thought. I mean, I was always loyal."
Nye's shoulders sank and he sighed mournfully. Another tremor shook through the building. They grabbed the banister as they staggered. Nye scowled.
"Damn it all!"
Normally so calm, his voice had descended into a growl.
"We've been doing our best here, we have, but the mistress has disappeared, sir. She didn't go to America like the master claimed. All her clothes are still here, where she left them, and servants have either run away or disappeared. The master is not himself. There's something ill at Starless, gravely ill. You must do something, please."
Nye seemed like a man who wouldn't normally beg. He wore his pride with stoicism, but his resolve was all used up. He had nothing left. Hagen gritted his teeth and rolled up his sleeves, intricate tattoos covering the length of his arms. "Where is he?" he asked, trying to quell the furious beating of his heart.
In the library. He never leaves. Dear God."
A loud crash and a shriek. The wood of the house began to creak and twist.
"Oh, sweet Jesus!"
Edda screamed. "Both of you!" shouted Hagen. "Get out of here!" Tonight was the last straw, and they fled as though their lives depended on it, as they probably did. Hagen, armed with every weapon at his disposal, both physical and mental, marched towards the library. With each step closer through the labyrinthine mansion, the icon screamed louder and louder at him. "There's danger. I don't know how much I can protect you." Hagen carried on. He owed it to his friend. Hagen sank deeper into the building, down twisting, descending hallways, the light from his lantern barely penetrating the oily gloom. Further along into older passages, the corridors narrowed and wood panelling gave way to bare stone. Hagen had never ventured into these recesses. Elias's father had refused entry to all, much to Hagen's consternation. The icon led this way, its surface becoming almost unbearably hot, the vibration within its core absolutely frenetic, the voice ever louder in Hagen's thoughts. The house boomed again as the foundations shook violently. Hagen stumbled and reached out to the wall. Moisture slickened the surface, sending instant waves of repulsion through him. The tightness of the space, the heat, the misery. He could hear the guns calling out across the field. His heart pounded viciously. Keep away from the memories. Come back. Don't submit. Just come back. The scene became vapor, and he pushed on. There was magic at work here, desperately trying to break him. The nearer he got, the more ill the air became, thickening and reeking, burning his nostrils and settling in the back of his throat. He gagged and spat on the ground. He could hear the sound of movement, slow, wet. Why was the bloody lantern getting dimmer? He groped around in the half-light for the source, moving closer and closer to the ground. Mere inches from the boards, he saw strands of tubular structures, yellowish fluid seeping from them, a regular pulsation across their length. They trailed off into the distance, towards the library. Hagen cocked the hammer of his pistol and levelled his aim, his movements ever more cautious. Chill tremors in his guts asked him to stop and turn around, to flee from this place and never look back. Why was he racing towards danger? He had a life. He had Joe. This was lunacy, wasn't it? But he and Elias were indebted to one another. He couldn't abandon him.
You challenge a god? Such insignificant beasts.
He could see the arms reaching out towards them both, the smooth marble of the crypt's floor ready to receive their blood. Elias's voice was ringing in his ears.
We have to stop this thing.
Come back. It isn't real. It isn't real. The memory was harder to shrug off. It dug its nails into him. It held on for dear life. It did not wish to let him go. Hagen writhed to break free, emerging only once a battle had been waged in his mind. His shaking hand put the lantern onto the ground. Taking a penknife from his pocket, he flipped out the blade and held his left forearm to the dim light. There was the pattern of an eye, with an absorbing intricacy that could pull in your gaze. Taking the point of the blade, he traced the design, letting trickles of blood run down. Droplets cascaded to the floor. Reality reformed, his perceptions anchored once again to the physical. Putting the knife away, he took his handkerchief and wiped away the excess blood. Sweat gathered at his forehead, little anxieties wanting to grow in his thoughts. They would have to wait. He had to continue. The library doors lay warped and splintered on the floor outside, the organic mass of tendrils roving over and under, reaching out into the building and deeper into the ground. Light emanated from the room, a reddish hue tinting each ray as it was cast across the walls. Hagen set the lantern on the floor and took a deep breath, trying not to gag on the noxious odours. You may as well come in, Hagen. Elias's voice called out. It echoed through the vast library chamber, lending it an eerie tone. Hagen's grip on the pistol tightened as the words reached him. His heart beat a little faster. The icon screamed ever louder. Stepping away from the doorway, Hagen was met by a nauseating vista. Blood and human matter clung to the walls, reaching out like greedy fingers towards the center of the space. There, suspended, was Elias, but changed. His human biology succumbing to a new set of rules, blood running from his eyes, a laugh coming from his lips. He seemed to be in pleasure. The sight sucked Hagen inwards. The walls were pulsating with a dark energy of death, the flow of matter like the beating of corrupted hearts. Elias seemed to revel in it. All this flesh and blood was feeding him. Elias! Hagen called out, his nerves quivering the word as it emerged from his lips. Good God, he laughed. Finally! How long do you need to get here? I had to travel back from Canada. I was there. Elias chuckled. Oh, Canada, oh, Canada. He laughed some more. Living out there with her, aren't you? Never cared for her people. Hagen was trying to keep a lid on his anger and his disgust. The whole sight of the blood, the twisted flesh, the protruding bone, the room was almost part of Elias. He could smell bile, gnawing acid, and the iron of blood. Why don't you just tell me what you want? Hagen was trying to sound more confident, even if it was only to convince himself.
My God, you're impatient. Is there no time for conversation? You're always such a sullen bast...
You're not Elias.
The creature laughed. Well, that is damn obvious, isn't it? Elias is mine.
Suit of armor, shall we say.
So many useful memories in this little man. So much more than the sack of flesh I expected.
Hagen's friend was dead. He knew that. Whatever was remaining had been repurposed to giving strength and sustenance to this hideous creature as it sought physical form. The young man who had saved his life countless times, who had become his friend in the squalid hell of the war, who had shown relentless bravery, he was gone. Hagen felt tears and rage at the back of his eyes. He wanted to scream. He clamped his teeth together and stared at him, a baleful glare of hatred in his eyes.
Why am I here?
He snarled. The creature leaned forward. The flesh it was suspended from slackened to bring him closer to the ground. He was 6 feet away at best.
Because you and your boy fucked with us.
It grinned maniacally.
You fucked with something older than time itself and thought there'd be no consequence. You pitiful sacks of meat.
Daikon drummed at the back of his every thought, demanding to be heard. Hagen travelled inside his mind for a moment, a matrix of doorways leading to memories, people and knowledge. He pushed through the largest door and welcomed the entity of the icon into his mind once again. Augmenting his senses, it opened up Hagen's sight to the true reality. As his eyes slid open, the creature was shrouded in a new green aura of ethereal energy. Strands of it reached towards the heavens, and blinding red energy pulsed through the fleshy arteries that fed it.
Can you see now?
It's funny. You show me the puppet, but where, pray tell, is the puppet master? Hagen's eyes followed the green energy to the heights of the ceiling and concentrated, piercing the shield the creature was concealing itself with. A slender, winged beast of bone and ligament stretched out above, its pointed head staring down at the corporeal play being carried out below. Long arms draped down to the ground, pointed with razor claws. It shone with green light and sheared a light as it came to exact its revenge. Hagen's heart almost stopped. Weymouth, he called out, and the creature suddenly seemed less sure of itself. Whilst the form of Elias remained still, the ethereal creature shifted with evident discomfort at having its name spoken aloud. It fought to quickly conceal its feelings.
You thought, the Elias puppet said, that I was dead, that you destroyed me, that the cathedral was my tomb.
Hagen watched the creature scuttling back into the corner, the connection between it and the remainder of his friend in full force.
I had hoped,
Hagen replied. The puppet cackled in response. Hope was of amusement to it, clearly deriding the notion.
You really are pathetic, aren't you?
Spittle flew from its lips as it became more animated in speech.
A little part of me lived on, and I've been waiting as my strength returned.
More of the tendrils began to creep across the floor, to remain unseen by Hagen. The creature continued to engage him, looking to create a distraction. A god reduced to petty revenge, and you call us pathetic? You're just a mindless butcher looking to feed yourself. You were no different when we found you, a wretched, corpulent beast grown fat and all the death around you. His nostrils flared at the thought of all the good men who had perished at the hands of this thing. A tendril wriggled across the floor to snatch at his ankle. Through the power of the icon, he saw the flash of energy as it went to attack. He twisted about and pulled the trigger of his pistol. The hammer slammed down and a shot rang out. Blood began to flow from the writhing flesh. The puppet recoiled in pain, its yelp drawing Hagen's attention. 5 more chambered rounds. He began firing furiously at him. 3 missed. 2 more tore through the suspending tendrils. Blood and mucus spurted from them, spraying through the air. The puppet hissed, and he saw the ethereal beast recoil, the flow of energy stuttering. Running over to one of the mahogany desks, he flipped it over on its side to create cover. He had enough for 2 reloads in his pocket. With shaking hands, he pushed fresh rounds into the chamber and took the pistol into his trousers. Dropping the trench gun off his shoulder, he cocked the slide and took a deep, calming breath. He could see colours of energy dancing around the room, evoking the beauty of the northern lights. His concentration slipped for the scantest moment. A razor-sharp claw burst through the wood, sending a hail of splinters. Shards of wood scraped across Hagen's face, blood leaping from the wounds. He cursed and rolled to the ground. Then he heard snarling, bloodthirsty, mindless snarling. The beasts from the trench. As it opened its maw wide open to sink its teeth into his face, Hagen jammed the shotgun upwards and fired. The top of its skull exploded, shattering bone and bursting grey matter. The creature's entire head ended up on the floor, with only part of its mandible in one piece. The icon roared at Hagen. He rolled over to see another of the fiends leaping through the air above him, its claws ready to rip his chest wide open. He cocked the trench gun and pulled the trigger. Its simple anatomy dropped out of its abdomen whilst other bits of matter rained from the fresh hole in its back. The corpse slammed on top of Hagen, winding him. Blood, and God knew what else, was starting to pour out across his body. He scrambled to move, pushing the body just enough to slide out from under it. Stumbling to his feet, he began to run to the next level of the library. Another of the creatures was hot on his heels, growling and gnashing just out of reach, its teeth and claws thirsting for his delicious flesh. Sweat was already running from every pore in Hagen's body. The smell of blood and shit was turning his stomach, but the adrenaline in his veins was just telling him to shut up. The creature swiped at him, sinking almost a quarter of an inch into his calf. His trousers were no protection, as the beast ferociously tore into him. Hagen yelled and threw himself over a short bookcase. It was too late for the creature to react, and its head slammed into volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Clumsily pivoting, Hagen cocked the gun again and fired into the dazed creature's head. It did not have a single moment to make an utterance as it succumbed to the wrath of Hagen. Ripping the slashed portion of trouser leg off, he tore it into a strip and tied it around the cut. It seared with pain and bled so readily. He had to shove those thoughts away. He needed to get this thing on the back foot. He got up and over to the railing. The ethereal creature and the puppet were merging. The green energy flowed ever brighter as they became one. In a panic, Hagen fired again, black ichor rupturing from the fleshy tendril. There was another screech of pain, but it was too late. The confluence was already too far gone. Feeding the spare shells into the gun, he prepared himself. Wounded and disorientated, it having been so long without a physical form, Weymouth struggled to keep control of his puppet's body. As another shot ripped through the last of the feeding tendrils that had fed him all the blood and flesh of the human beasts, he stumbled to the ground. Rolling in the organic refuse around him, he rolled along until he slammed into one of the tower bookcases. This damned Hagen wasn't giving up easily. He hadn't succumbed to his initial glamours. The attempts to trap him inside his own memories, they should have had him lost in a maze of his own mind. He had magic, this one. Dangerous magic. He needed a way out, and quickly. This flesh puppet gave him many freedoms, but it also gave him corporeal weakness. He had to be careful in this reality. He scurried into a corner and began to concentrate. This entire room was perfect for focusing his abilities. Set on a prime intersection of ley lines, he could feel the power course through this place. It had taken time, but it had bent to his will. Now, it would take him to freedom. The geometry of the room began to change. Staring down at what was now exclusively Weymouth, Hagen's heart sank. He knew his friend was already gone, but this final act seemed like the most egregious insult to his memory. He knew what he had to do. Levelling up the shot, he muttered a regretful goodbye. This was the end. The icon shrieked and the beast slammed into Hagen's chest, hurling him squarely into a bookcase, his trench gun flying from his grip and sliding across the polished wood floors. The world was spinning. Where was he? What was he doing? What? He heard the pounding of the creature's feet shaking the floor beneath. Books had fallen all around him, and everything still seemed so unreal. He was trying so hard to have a clear thought. Could he just... Hagen grabbed a large tome from the ground and thrust it upwards. The teeth of the beast sank through the leather and pages of vellum. Hagen got back on his feet and pulled the pistol from his waistband. He pressed it against the eye of that which would have killed him. He fired, and the eye burst. He fired again, and blood began pouring from the socket. The creature tried to spit out the great book from its mouth, but it was too late. Hagen fired again, and the back of its head finally gave out. Pulpy material oozed out of the wound, and the whole creature went slack. Hagen ran over to the trench gun, picked it up, and ran to the railing. The room had changed. It had physically changed. Bookcases and walls rearranged to create an archway on the lowest tier. An unreal red light poured out from it and illuminated far and wide. He could not see Weymouth. He had already run. Hagen darted back down to the ground floor. The wooden stones around the exit had already begun to quiver as the strain of supporting this unnatural doorway began to destroy them. Hagen did not know where this threshold led, but he would go. He would race into that light and pursue that twisted god. He would find it and destroy it once and for all. In doing so, his friend would be free. Hagen stepped through the archway, its form collapsing behind him, followed by the bricks and mortar of the cursed Starless Towers.